Recording has begun.
Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're located. Everybody, thanks for joining the Tech Talk this afternoon. What I'm going to be discussing is basically the process and the mechanisms and the tools that are in place for people who will be contributing, either updating existing EdgeX documentation, or possibly you're working on one of the new areas for the new release, and you may have to be creating some new documentation for EdgeX. So there's a couple of things, or a number of things we're going to cover off this afternoon. So the first thing is basically how you access the existing EdgeX documentation. We'll have a look at where the documentation lives in the repository and how it's laid out and why it's structured the way it is. Importantly, how to take a copy of the repository, clone the repository, and then build the EdgeX documentation, and do the initial build, which actually creates a Docker image for the documentation build system, and then you use the same the build system for doing updates or any additions. We'll look at the actual existing structure of how we've created the initial set of EdgeX documentation, and some of the key things that we'll look at is particularly things like if you want to add new sections and new chapters, what you need to do that. And then we'll do a tutorial on all of the basic things I think that you probably need to know initially when you're creating or updating the EdgeX documentation. The documentation that lives in the repository is created in something we call restructured text. It's basically a markup language based on a simple text file, and we use the Sphinx documentation generation system to build the outputted document artifacts, which in this case is basically a set of HTML and a framework to run it from a HTML website. Sphinx itself is very flexible, and we can generate other output formats, potentially going forward, like PDF or other types of documentation. But at the minute, we generated HTML. So all of the EdgeX documentation is now held. All of the restructured text files and all of the graphics and images that are referenced within the EdgeX documentation files are held in the Go Mono repository underneath the documentation directory. As I said, it contains, it's got a hierarchical structure, which we'll look at in a second, and it basically contains a bunch of REST files or files with a REST extension, and graphic files and PNGs, JPEGs, etc. There are some supporting Sphinx configuration files that basically control things like the look and feel, but those things you probably not ever have to edit. Those will be changing very infrequently. So I'll have a look at the actual repository in a second, but the repository has been laid out in terms of the structure or the hierarchy underneath the documentation directory to kind of align with the actual generated documentation as it is. So there's actually there's hundreds of files, and to make it easier to read and easier to access, we've broken it down to a number of directories. And as I said, these align with some of the core parts, sections, and chapters that are in the EdgeX documentation as it stands today. So for example, things like underneath docs, there's an examples directory in the repository, and that's where we put all of the documents that relate to things like the EdgeX Foundry examples and tutorials section, or the getting started directory, etc., etc. So it hopefully makes it a little bit easier to navigate and be able to update the documentation and find it when you need to do that. If you need to, in terms of actually getting hold of the documentation, well, the first thing you need to do is to clone the EdgeX mono repo or the EdgeX Go repository. So you can either use a SSH in a git clone command, or you can use HTTPS to clone the directory. And then you go from the root of the EdgeX Go directory into the docs directory. And then within that directory, there's a script called build.sh. And we use the build.sh script to initially build the Docker image, or the Docker build image, a Docker doc build image, which is used to build the documentation. And then we use the build.sh once the image has been built to subsequently, if you add in files or make an update, you just run the same script again. So initially, it builds the Dockerized version of the build system for the documentation, and then for subsequent invocations, it's used to update the docs. On the first time you run it, it's going to, as I said, it's going to build the Docker doc build image, and it's probably going to take about 5 minutes to run. But after it's built once the image is built, on any subsequent invocation, it takes about 25 seconds. I'll show you that in a minute. So the first thing I'll just want to do is I'll switch into my VM, and I'll show you where everything's held. So this is the mono repository on EdgeX Foundry. This is EdgeX Go. All of the docs are held under the docs directory, which I mentioned before. This is all the subdirectories in the hierarchy, and I said it aligns with the main parts, sections, and chapters that are actually in the current documentation set. Take a look in one of the directories. This is the examples directory. As you'll see a set of RST files. These are the, if you like, the content files that are basically text files which are marked up with the restricted text markup language. And then there's also a bunch of JPEGs and PNGs, and these are the graphics files, etc., that are referenced from the RST files. So the first thing I'll do is I'm not going to clone the repository because it takes about 10 minutes to pull it all down. So this is what I've set up previously. I've cloned the repository. I've CD'd into the docs directory. I've actually built the image because, again, I don't want to spend 5 minutes building the image, but I can now run the build.sh script again, and I'll show you what's actually generated. So this takes about maybe 25 seconds. So each time you update a file and you want to see what the new output is, you run the build.sh file. It's very simple and straightforward. Not only does it build the restructured text files for the core HTML, it also it reads the RAML files and it runs RAML to HTML as part of the build process as well. Creates the HTML files for the API reference documentation, and it merges it all into the outputted HTML page. And this is what it actually generates. So this is our current EdgeX documentation set from those source RST files or restricted text files that are in the mono repository. So it's quite simple. You clone the repository, CD into the docs directory, run the build.sh file, and then you're in business. You can update and add files and then rebuild very easily. So I'll just switch back to my slides and we'll push on. There's a couple of key files that are worth mentioning. Most of the, if you like, the chapter and subchapter files, basically you give them the name, a sensible name, and they have a .rst extension. There's a couple of files that are special in the documentation build system which are worth mentioning. There's the file called conf.py. This is used by the Sphinx build system. In particular, it's used to control a lot of the things related to the look and feel of the outputted documentation, in this case, the HTML website. It's where we select things like we call a theme. The theme is basically the style sheet that gives the look and feel for that website that I've just demonstrated, which is what we're using for EdgeX currently. The other file of note is the index.rst file. This is the top level file in the whole documentation hierarchy, and it's where you basically start defining your documentation structure. And this is, we'll have a look at the file in a little bit more detail, but this is, for example, this is the index.rst file. We've got a, there's some commented text at the top. I've got a reference to a logo, which you've seen on the website already. There's a title for the welcome to the EdgeX documentation, but the next section is quite important. This top tree directive, this basically is how you define the table of contents in the index.rst file. So you can specify things like the max depth, which is how many levels of hierarchy are actually visible on the top level page, whether the hierarchies or the table of contents numbered. You can add a caption, got it called contents. And then the important thing is where you define the high level parts of the structure of the documentation. So in this case, we've got things called, you've got CH intro, architecture getting started, and that maps across, if you like, to these high level parts and chapters within the generated documentation. We've also got this thing called search at the bottom, and this adds an automatic search facility into the documentation. So if we're going to for example, add a new part or a new top level chapter into the documentation, you have to edit this section within the top tree. So it's pretty easy to do. So the first step is to add a new element. Say, for example, I'm going to add a new document part. I've called it ch new document part. I add that to the index.rst file. And then to actually generate this in the new documentation, I have to create a document called, which is the same title as the part reference. So I create a file called ch new document part.rst. I give it a title. Which is going to be that's going to be referenced on the index.rst page, on the top level page. And then I can generate, once that file has been created, I can now generate a new entry at the top level for a new part section. I'm going to show you that in a second. What you can do, obviously, is you can have subchapters and other parts. So, for example, if I want to have more hierarchy under the new section that I've added, I repeat the process. So I put a new top tree directive in the ch new document part RST file, and then I can add subchapters as we go. Or you can simply just add new content. If you don't have to have additional subchapters if you want. You can just add content directly in here. So if I flick back to the VM again, I'm going to show you this. So this is the index.rst file. I'm going to uncomment the new part that I'm going to add, and I'll save it. This is the new document part.rst file. So remember, you've got to create a file with the name of the new part or a chapter or subsection that you're going to add. You have to you give it a title, and the title is going to be the thing that's displayed on the page that references. In this case, I have got another table of contents, but I haven't created any more subchapter pages at the minute, so they won't actually be dragged in. And then what I can do is I go back to my build environment, and I'm going to build it again, and hopefully it's going to do it in about 20 seconds this time. It's doing the RAML now. And it's done. So if I go back and I refresh now, hopefully you can see that I've added another part onto the high-level index page. And if I click on it, it's pulled in the title, but there's nothing in it. So that's the first thing that one of the key things that you may need to do is to add, especially if you're adding, if there's new, if you're one of the guys that are working on something like, say, the new security functionality that's coming along, we may have to have a security high level chapter that's added to the documentation. So that's how you do it. Okay, so in the next sections, I'm going to kind of cover the basics of the restructured text markup language. Particularly, the language is really rich, and you can do some incredibly, sophisticated things with it if you like. I'm going to cover off all the basic things I think you need to know, and particularly these are the things that we used when we marked up the first set of documentation. So it ties everything that you see when you look through the files. This next set of sort of basic tutorials is going to you'll see these things being used in action. Okay, so the first thing I'll talk about is sections and headings. You basically, you can create headings at different levels by using, as equal signs at the top level, or well, at the very highest level, as I said, for the title of the part, I used the hash, but particularly in the documentation for first heading ones and heading twos, I used overlined equal signs. That creates a heading one. Or if you want to use the minus sign across the top of your text to create a heading style 2 for a subsection, or you can use the up arrow or quotes, up arrow for further subsections. So it's very easy just by using underlining and overlining your text to create headings and subheadings, etc., etc. I'll cover a couple more, then we'll go back and we'll generate some of these things as examples. The other things that are used, so obviously when you've created your new document, you're going to start creating structure within the document. So it's going to consist of headings. You're going to put some text blocks, etc., text in it. Another thing that is used a lot throughout the documentation are lists. And this basically covers things like bulleted lists or numbers lists. To do numbers lists, it's very easy. You just use the asterisk with a space, and that will generate into a bullet. Numbered lists, you can do two things. You can be explicit by doing like number 1 dot in a space and number 2 dot, and that will generate a numbered list based on the numbering. Or you can be dynamic by using the hash dot, and it will auto-generate the numbers into a list. You can have nested lists as well. So the important thing about a nested list is if you need a sub-bullet, you have to leave a space and you have to indent. And then that will create the nested list. So if I flick back again to my VM, I'm going to quickly show you that. So we're going to cover off the last two slides where we talked about headings and subheadings and lists, bullets and numbers. So if I save it again and I build it, I've grouped these tutorials into blocks. So there's about three more rebuilds, and then we'll have covered everything. So I know it takes about 25 seconds or something, but I'm not going to do it for every single element that we're gonna cover today. Okay, so it's regenerated again, and hopefully if I refresh, you can see I've added a heading 1 style, and I've put I've got a title, a heading, a major heading, and a subheading. Then I've got demonstrated there's a bullet and a sub bullet. There's a numbered list which was explicitly numbered, and then there's a new list which was the numbers were auto assigned by the generation by Sphinx. Very simple. Once you get the hang of it, but very powerful as well. Okay, so the next couple of elements that I want to talk about are literal blocks and tables. We used literal blocks have been used throughout the document to actually highlight and group together code segments. So it's using the double colon for the literal blocks. Basically, if you put a white space before the literal block, the literal signs won't be included. Or actually, it will include a single colon. If you put nothing before the literal blocks, then the literal block itself, the symbol is not included. It won't be included at all. And I'll show you that in a second. They're very easy and they're very useful for, as I said, putting code blocks or demonstrating APIs and their signatures, etc. And we use it throughout the generated documentation. The next element that I want to talk about, again, is used heavily within the current documentation, are tables. And there's basically two ways to do tables. There's a simpler form, but it's not as flexible. You can't have multiple lines, for example, in the first element of the column. The preferred approach, and is what we use throughout the current documentation, is what you see in terms of the first example here. And unfortunately there's not a kind of fast way of doing tables in restructured text. You have to basically use the plus sign, the minus sign, and the dividing line to actually section off your tables. Within the docs, that in the repository, there's lots of examples of doing this, and it's basically you manipulate the minuses and the pluses to create the number of cells, the number of columns, and then the number of lines that you need to add to include your text for your particular table. So I'll show you both the literal blocks and the tables. So if you said this is the marker for the literal block, there's nothing before it. So basically, all it's going to do is take this body text, which is actually, I think it's one of the elements from one of our API calls, and it's going to put it into this text block. And this is again another example. This is a table, as I said, which we created. It's used, I think, this table is used in quite a number of places to basically describe, start and stop in the microservices. So I will go back and regenerate it, and you can have a look to see what the output looks like. Okay, it's done. And if I refresh again, so here's my literal block. So basically what we're saying is include all of the text that is referenced in the literal block as it is. It's quite nice though. So if you have a big block of code, obviously you get a nice big block. But also if there's a lot of text width-wise, it actually gives you a scrolling bar. So you can scroll across, and as I said, we've used this extensively in the documentation so far. It's a very useful, very useful markup for the files. And then this is the table that was generated from, you know, that those minuses, pluses, and dividing lines. So you can create, with respect to the tables as well, there are a bunch of directives that you can add to the table in terms of, I didn't cover it off here, but I'll talk about some of the reference documentation for further reading after I've covered it, went through the tutorial. But you can do things like you can specify specific column widths, you can center the tables, etc., etc. That's particularly useful if you're going to generate other output formats, things like PDF documents. The tables that we've used so far, we've not had to use that too much for the EdgeX documentation because they've generated nicely into HTML. But if you generate a PDF, say an A4 document, you have to control a lot the width of the tables a lot more carefully. So you have to specify, you know, individual columns to get a nice output. But we didn't have to use it up to this point. Okay. Okay. So the next thing that I want to talk about are links, both external and internal. So if you need to reference some external website, for example, if your link is basically, if the text for your link is the same as the link, you don't have to do anything special. You just put the URL into the text. But if you're going to use an inline web link, so where you're going to have the you know, the underlying URL and have some the text. Have some different text to represent that, then you have to use the markup that's shown here. And I'm going to demonstrate that as well. It's really easy to use. So in this case, what we're doing, we're going to, this paragraph contains a link, and that's the text that's going to be displayed, and then you reference a link, and then the URL that it's actually going to talk to. The other type of link, there's a whole bunch of other type of internal links that you can use for things like cross-referencing, etc. And there's a lot of you know, there's a lot of different things you can do with internal links and cross-references. And there's a link here to part of one of the documentation resources, I think, which goes into it, and it's very powerful, but it's too much to cover off today. But one of the things that it's worth highlighting is the doc link, which is used extensively throughout the current documentation, and we use that to reference internal documentation that's bundled with or files that are bundled within the documentation set, or references to other pages or chapters within the documentation set. Now you can do two things with this. You can either have you can either specify these doc links in absolute terms, or you can specify it in relative terms. Most of the stuff I think that we reference in the docs as they are today, we've used the absolute paths to the documentation, but it's used throughout the documentation, and I'm going to demonstrate that in a sec. The other thing. So that's basically external links and internal links. The other thing that we use a lot, obviously, to pull in things like graphics and images is the image directive. It's really simple to use. In basic terms, you just specify .image and then point to the file. But if you want to get more sophisticated and things like control the actual size of the image, the scaling of the image, and the alignment of the image, there are a bunch of directives that you can add to it to make the image sit exactly where you want it on the page at the right size, etc., etc., etc. So I'm just going to go back to the VM again. And I'm going to show you the images and the internal and external links. And save that away. So you can see hopefully get an idea of how powerful the restructured text formatting is when it combined with Sphinx. But at the same time, it's really quite easy to use once you've kind of got up to speed with the basics, which doesn't take very long at all. You can mark up these files in quite a simple way. But what the Sphinx toolchain does generates some really nice output from that basic markup. So that's done again, and I'll refresh. So there's the first thing. The first thing we did was create a link to an image, which in this case is our good old EdgeX diagram. This one was highlighting the core services. Then I've got an inline link, which is pointing to an external URL. I think in this case it's going off-site to the wiki. Remember, yeah, it's going off-site to the wiki. So there's an external link. And then this time I'm referencing one of the pages within the actual generated documentation, or within this site itself, which is a client registration page. So this is referencing one of the generated documentation pages. So there's images, external links, and internal links. Okay, so the final couple of markup elements that I want to cover off are basically how you emphasize things and adding comments to your files. So basically, to add emphasis or to make things bold or add things in italics, you can use asterisks. So a single asterisk around a piece of text with a closing asterisk for italics. 2 asterisks is on either end of your text for making something bold. Or you can put a two single backslash quotes to actually emphasize something as a code snippet. If you're going to use bold or emphasizing text within a running piece of text, then you have to use escape characters, which is the backslash. So you have to do things like, if you have a sentence and you want to highlight a particular word, the word that you're going to highlight, you have to start with a backslash, with a space, with the asterisk or asterisks for the bold, close the asterisk, put another space and another backslash, and then it will be interpreted correctly. I'm going to show you that in a second. And then the final thing that I think you'll need to know to start creating documents and or updating existing ones is to basically how to add comments, which are not obviously going to be visible when you generate the documents. And it's very easy. Basically, it's 2 dots and a space for any text that you want to add as a comment. And if you indent the lines below it, they're still included in the comment. So it's really easy. So we'll go back to the VM and we'll show the generation of those final elements and what they look like. So this is the comment at the bottom, just with the 2 lines. That is not going to be generated, of course. And then there's the examples of emphasis, bold, and italics. And we'll just regenerate it again. This is the final time we'll regenerate. Once we get to the RAML, it's nearly done. And there we go. So there's an example of the 2 asterisks surrounding the piece of block of text to put it in bold. Single asterisk puts the text in italics. If you put double single backslashes around your code, you get like a mini code block. Actually, that is not correct. Let me have a quick look at that. Perhaps the spaces weren't added. It's deliberate mistake. I think we need to have a space there. Oops. Space there. Just trying to regenerate this for completeness. That's it. Hopefully I've got it right this time. And that word should be in bold, and there it is. So it was my little mistake before, so that's how you put a emphasis for a particular word in a block, a bit of text. And actually, there's another mistake there. There should be 2 dots. I won't regenerate it. That's a comment, not lines. So we'll just go back and see where we got to with here. Just recap what we did. So we showed how to add a new part to the overall structure, a new high-level chapter, if you like. You can add sub-chapters beneath that, how to give it a title, how to start restructuring an individual file in terms of headings, how to use bullets and lists, numbers, etc. How to use literal blocks for highlighting things like chunks of code or API signatures, etc. Using tables is very important because we use tables a lot throughout the existing documentation. How to include images and how to do things like links to external URLs or internal references to document pages or documents that are internal to the generated documentation. And then finally, how to add emphasis in things like bold and italics to your text. You know, obviously the other thing what you're going to be doing is adding main bodies of text, and that's very simple. You just add your text in as you would with any other text file. It's very, very simple. So the final slide I've got here is just some references to some very useful resources in terms of things like quick starts and cheat sheets for the restricted text markup syntax. The one at the top in particular, I use this one a lot. I think this is particularly useful. Oops. Quickly go to the site and show you. This Sphinx primer, it covers off all of the things that I've covered today and a lot more, and goes into things in a lot of depth, particularly things like references and links and stuff. There's a lot of really good information on here, and I use this as a particularly good resource. And as I said, there's a couple of more things where some individual developers have put their own their own cheat sheets together with, what they think are some of the most important parts of the markup language. So take a look at them. So Well, that concludes my tech talk, my restructured text basics training. So we've got time left. So if anybody has any questions, why don't we throw it open, and you can ask me any questions that you have. If not, I can give you some more of your day back.
Hey, this is Ton from the Linux Foundation. I was wondering where you're hosting the docs.
The docs are on the EdgeX repository in the EdgeX Go mono repository. So, oh, sorry, and where the outputted docs are going to be hosted?
Yeah,
so
the generated docs that an end user would look at.
Yeah, well, at the minute we're in the process of hosting them on the Linux Foundation infrastructure. So the generated docs are not publicly available yet. There will be in the next few days, hopefully. But if I can come out of here, how do I?
Yeah, we're gonna host them on a Nexus site repo.
On Nexus, have you guys thought about using Read the Docs? Many of the other Linux Foundation projects are actually using Read the Docs, and Read the Docs is actually kind of cool because it lets you have multiple versions of your docs, and that has a link that makes it easy to switch between different versions.
That's a very good question. Yes, we are aware of Read the Docs, and we've discussed that. A lot of the stuff that's hosted on Read the Docs, a lot of the projects don't necessarily have their own websites or their own infrastructure. A lot of the projects are just simply GitHub repositories. So hosting on Read the Docs makes a lot of good sense. It's not always the case. There are some big projects that still use Read the Docs. But we took the decision, certainly in the short term, is that we're going to host it on our own infrastructure. Yeah, so that's certainly in the short term, we've decided that we'll host it. We'll generate it overnight as part of the CI, and then it will be referenced from the wiki in terms of where you get the updated link on it, each morning when the docs are being updated. So Read the Docs is something we're aware of. Lots of other Linux Foundation and other projects use it, but in the short term, we've decided that it will be, the outputted documentation will be hosted on the EdgeX Foundry infrastructure. I just want to point out, if you want to have a look at the generated documentation as it currently is, IATech, the company I work with, we've put a preview of it, the documentation, up on our community page on the IATech SYS website. So if you want to actually look at what's currently, the current state of it, you can actually go and look at that, look at the generated output on our website. But as Jeremy said, we should be hosting it on the project infrastructure very, very shortly.
Hey, Andy, Rodney here. You did great work here, and I really like what you've put together. This is really awesome. I was thinking for your presentation, maybe you can add a link to the approval process, or if someone wanted to make contributions to the document, or say,
yep,
needs to add a whole section to it. For example, I'm looking at putting in something for security and for the key name server. So I'd be adding probably a new chapter to the structure of this documentation. And I'm assuming we would want to have some review of this, coordination. There might be input about where's the best place of putting this. And so do you have a pointer to the process that one should follow when adding to the documentation?
That's a good question.
Process?
So the intention is to basically follow the general process, obviously, for adding files and committing files. So basically, if you're going to add something new you're at the point where you want to commit something back into the EdgeX repository, then you're going to basically do your local commits into your EdgeX fork, and then you're going to issue a pull request. and then, you know, the people that are reviewing the docs are going to give you approval or not. If you're going to add a new chapter, intend to add a new chapter and want initial feedback before you even start, that's a good question. Probably you want to, maybe something that you need to send, you know, post to the mailing list to start with, the core working group or the QA test, to get the process kicked off.
So who owns documentation? Is it the individual applications working groups, or who actually owns this?
Well, the intention, to start with, the first set of documentation that was marked up was done by basically the QA test working group. That was my working group did this initial work. But the intention going forward is that each of the individual working groups take responsibility for the sections that relate to their, you know, their areas of work expertise. So in terms of people, reviewers on for new updates, my expectation is that people from each of the specific areas will be added to the review list for the documentation.
Okay, that'll work for now. We may revise this as we get more mileage on the process, but that's certainly workable for now.
But I think perhaps it's, you know, there may be some additional guidelines in terms of, as you said, how do we, you know, if you're gonna add new sections and stuff like that, or need to do that imminently, we should probably send up a note out or some guidelines for how to kick that off and how the process should run.
Yeah, but maybe we'll get to that point. I think right now I'll probably post stuff to a mailing list to key stakeholders and go from there and see how well that works out, especially since this is very new. Yeah, but I love what you put together. This is great. Okay,
great. As I said, once you start doing it, it's very, very simple. Once you've learned some of the basics, and the build thing that we've put together in terms of putting it, if you like, Dockerizing the Sphinx build tool chain and the Raml to HTML chain, you know, it's not quite as fast as if you install the tools natively, but it's very easy to just, as I said, to build, rebuild, and rebuild and update, etc. It makes it the process very simple. Any more questions? All right. If anybody does have any follow-up stuff after the meeting, you can obviously post questions to the news groups, or you can contact me directly, and I'll be more than happy to answer any of your questions. Thanks very much for your time today, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.